And we're here to talk about our next panel, which is about the world of other works and AI. And we're going to be talking about interesting things like literature and video games. And so I'd like to welcome to the stage the panel for the world of other works.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. Of course.
Wait for the rest of the panel to get up here.
What's that?
Wait for the rest of the panel to get up here.
I had to race down from my daughter's birthday party at daycare
Oh, no.
today, so that ran a little long.
It's okay, you made it.
I'm actually a little sad I wasn't able to get a PowerPoint together because some of the things that I was planning on talking about are pretty funny. I knew there was a reason I liked your coat.
It was because we were going to hang out together?
Yeah, exactly.
That's nice.
Hi, I think we met before, actually. We were at the restatement.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to AI and creating a world of other works, also the panel right before lunch. So it'll be a good one. Obviously, AI is being used to create a wide variety of works. We just heard about visual art. After lunch, we're going to hear more about music. So now we're going to hear from people who work in some other areas, specifically video games and literary works. I'm going to have everyone kind of give their own presentation and talk about AI and how their own works kind of, I guess, tie into all of this. And at the end, if we have some time, then we're going to have some Q&A. So I'll just go through the lineup. Not everyone's quite in order, but Kayla is going to be first to talk. Kayla Page, she is senior counsel for Epic Games. Then we're going to have Jason Boog, who is the West Coast correspondent for Publishers Weekly. Then Mary Rasenberger, who is executive director of the Authors Guild. And then Meredith Rose, who is policy counsel for Public Knowledge. And Kayla's up.
All right. Hi, so Kayla, senior counsel, Epic Games, a small video game company that no one's ever heard of and definitely isn't in the press all the time. So Epic is at a kind of an interesting intersection of AI because it is both a game developer and publisher with that little-known title, Fortnite, that everyone loves, and also a game engine distributor. So in addition to actually creating immersive gameplay experiences and all of the AI that you may utilize to ensure you're enriching gameplay or matchmaking players effectively, they also support via the architecture, the game engine, the actual build out of this. So we're in a kind of unique position to watch how these items can play out from the programmer standpoint of the AI all the way into the final creative output that lands in the game. And just as a little bit of background, I don't know how familiar everyone is with software engines, but so games run on a game engine. You need an architecture below you that allows for efficient game design. So you need a rendering engine, right, for your 2D and 3D graphics. You need audio, you need physics, and you need AI at this point. I think that it's become a hot topic lately, but really video games and AI have been just inextricably, that's a word, linked since the 1950s when the first computer program was trained to play chess. And we have been pitting AI against human experts to try to, learn from them forever. You go back, even Pac-Man has the fundamental essentials of what is now environment-based AI. It's going to detect where you are. It's going to detect predict where you're likely to go, and based on those two inputs, decide on the creative-ish decision of whether it's going to chase you. And it's simplistic, but it's actually a really, really effective model. And so I like the model because for me, AI is a tool. Like video game companies are absolutely creators. They provide the creative direction, they provide the narrative structure, they provide all of the inputs that eventually that AI is going to utilize as a tool to create these outputs. But it's an increasingly sophisticated tool, but the bones are all the same. And so, I kind of analogize it often to artists, visual artists in a video game company. They're probably using Photoshop, right? That's a tool. And if you give a creative direction to an artist and 10 artists and 10 artists Photoshop, you're gonna get 10 different results. And so it's driven very much by the creative decisions that are being made inside of the company. So what I've enjoyed watching is the evolution, and I think a lot of the discussion here is like, okay, well, at what percentage, at what point are we going to say that there's been so much machine intervention that we've lost that human authorship that has the typical, copyright protections that attach to it. And it's definitely evolving. Early I was really static rules. It was a deterministic environment, so you're playing chess, right? There are only so many moves in chess. The board state is known, and it's very meticulously written code at that point. And when I say code, it's really just if-then statements. So if the player moves the knight to b3, you are going to react in this way. And now that doesn't really work anymore, right? These predictable experiences are gone. We have massively, MMOs that have tons and tons of players all around the world. The environment isn't static, it changes. And even if the environment has been coded at a base level to support certain physics, player interaction is going to change that in a second. I have, nieces and nephews that are like 14 and 15-year-old, and I can't predict that they're going to kick the cat in that game. And so when that cat hits the building, which it shouldn't, this is not my game. I don't have anything to do with this hypothetical game, nor am I in any way advocating any, sorry, PETA. But you have to consider like the physics of that, the physics of what we now support in games, of smoke, of light, of ray tracing that actually enables us to have these really realistic engines that are capable of doing things like we see in Pixar movies and giving real-time, real kind of humanity to these virtual worlds. And so I look at it now, and we've moved from this sort of static model to very much needing to utilize AI to ensure that things are functioning in-game as they should be. And that's just from a gameplay perspective. From an engine perspective, we support much, much more. But you end up in a situation where you simply could not efficiently, effectively, cost-effectively code for every possible contingency when you allow people to interact in a virtual environment. And so, some of the things that we see significant development in are things like adaptive gameplay. So you suck at video games. You're like, I've never picked up a controller. I don't have any idea what to do with this. And if you enter a video game and you're playing with these AI, with these bots that are non-player characters, NPCs, if they just kick your ass every time, it's not fun. It's not fun at all. And you have to hit this sweet spot, right, between it's too easy and I'm bored and I don't want to play and this isn't enjoyable, to I'm just being embarrassed. And so you get adaptive gameplay that allows players to either like match at commensurate skill levels, or an AI that's capable of kind of engaging with your gameplay style and giving you a more personalized experience so that you're not miserable the whole time. I heard somebody on an earlier panel mention accessibility. That's huge too. Natural language processing in AI is amazing. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with the numbers, but there are a staggering number of people with disabilities that play games because it's a really easy place to connect socially. It's like our online environments aren't fake online life anymore, right? They're part of our real life. So that sort of natural dialogue that happens is really well supported by natural language processing. We're not seeing a ton of that yet. It's pretty sophisticated, but there are many movers and shakers in Microsoft and in Amazon that are also trying to figure out how we can harness some of that to remove like toxic players in chat, get them out of there if they're harassing people, if they're just being inappropriate. Similarly, with immersive gameplay, you want non-player characters that actually feel like they're not walking into a wall 16 times. And you're just trying to interact with them. And it gives you this option to have like really believable and realistic body motion or dialogue options, or they could react to you emotionally in a way that they just couldn't do that prior. And in addition to like procedural content, which is just anything in the environment that needs to render real time as you walk around. So that's kind of the high level of those. I guess what I find interesting is the way that this is coded, because I think that often AI is either highly, highly simplified in a way that doesn't make it seem, it doesn't really let us get into the meat of the copyright issue. or it's just this black box of like, it's a neural network and we have no idea how this works. But it's actually, it's pretty interesting to watch it from the engine side when you go to code it. So if Unreal Engine 4 it has a lot of AI that it supports. And one of the things that you can do is let's take a very simple creature in a video game. We'll do an animal, right? Because there's no dialogue or anything. So you have a cat in a video game. And you need this cat to behave in a certain way. You have a creative expression. This is going to be a like mean tomcat who devil may care, whatever. And you need to code certain things for his behavior. You have to have action tasks that exist. So here's your root AI, right? And then you have a behavior that says the cat is going to groom itself. Okay, that's a pretty easy path, but you need things to make it seem lifelike. It can't just wait. It can't be a constant 20 seconds and then it grooms itself again. It's not very engaging. So you put conditions on it. Cat grooms itself. Cat also has a startle response, right? And you have to marry those two concepts as related. You have to say, okay, cat would not be grooming itself, like it's not lifting its leg and playing the cello, if it's startled because someone has thrown a bottle at its head. Okay. I'm really mean to cats in this. I didn't actually prepare this at all. I love cats. I have a cat. And so you have these interrelated tasks that without AI running real time, because you think about the three-dimensional space we occupy as human beings, the environment we have to interact with, body placement, movement, the way we react to things, the way that reaction changes when it's acted upon by another force. And you have to assign these all priorities or exceptions, or they're conditional. And so without AI to actually help facilitate those sorts of real-time, like machine learning feedback of, okay, we need to make this more and more realistic, you just don't get the same sort of immersive narrative experiences.
You can stay here, go there, wherever you want, for your PowerPoint.
I'm a journalist and an author. I'm going to speak about how writers use artificial intelligence right now. But I wanted to start by reading just a really short excerpt from it's a collection of essays. I had asked my parents for advice. They were at odds over whether or not I should go to the upcoming poetry competition. I grumbled at first, but I started to take action anyways. I asked my father for some of his old writing supplies, and he happily lent them to me. From that point forward, I took to spending my days in the studio, perfecting my craft. However, as the weeks passed by, it became increasingly difficult to stay focused on my goal. I turned to alcohol and illegal drugs, and I found that instead of relaxing and reflecting, my thoughts grew more chaotic, my actions more destructive. But when the judges arrived to hear that poem written by me, I was left with a bittersweet smile on my face. I was proud of myself for taking the challenge, and I wanted to continue this legacy and become a renowned poet. I didn't write that. That was my moment of narrative singularity. Last year I worked for 2 months to create an AI that could actually tell a small little story. And that, after reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of output, nonsense, all sorts of crazy stuff, that was the first time that my little AI told me a story. So if you can go to the first slide, I just put the text up there, and you can see I broke it into like the 3-act structure that you see in film. So you have like Act 1 when you introduce the conflict, and then Act 2 you have this young poet struggling with his craft. He even gets into drugs and alcohol, struggling to reach his goal of going to the poetry contest. And then you have Act 3 when he or she actually goes to the poetry competition and delivers a poem. And I cannot tell you how happy I was when I discovered that. And it was really magical. And I am not a coder. I worked with something called GPT-2, which was a model released by OpenAI last year. It was scraped from 8 million different web pages. And this language model, basically, when you feed it input, it will try to guess what the next part of that story is. So what I did is I fed this really super powerful AI a whole bunch of very short stories from this section of Reddit called Writing Prompts, and it's where people write very short stories, much like this, and I just gave it thousands and thousands of examples of those, and then turned it on and set it loose, and then I had to read hundreds of pages to find something like this, but when I found it, it was really magical. So that's one example of how people can work with AI. Here's another. This is Janelle Shan. She's an author who works a lot with different AIs and bots and things, and she took the names of spaceships from Ian Banks novels. I don't know if anyone reads Ian Banks novels, but they're amazing, and one of the best things are these self-aware AI-powered spaceships that fly around, and they all have really funny names like Prosthetic Conscience and things like that. And so she fed those names, hundreds of those names, to an AI, and it started to generate new fake names, and you can see some of them are up there. They're pretty hilarious. Happy to groom any animals you want, which would probably be good in our video game. Surprise, surprise, and that's that. And then she puts it up there, and thousands, hundreds and thousands of people love to read these. She's got a very popular blog, and she wrote a book recently as well. But her work is really wonderful. And that's one example of what writers are doing. Here's another one. This is from Alison Parrish, who teaches, she's a poet. She teaches at NYU. So she took a whole 3 million lines of poetry scraped from Project Gutenberg, and she put those into a collection and gave it, turned it loose on with a natural language processing AI, and that started to sort these millions of poetry lines into what they meant. It tried to come up with the best interpretation of what they meant. And then she took descriptions of movies from Wikipedia and fed those into it. And so what the computer did is it substituted for a synopsis of Star Wars, like the crawl that you see at the beginning of Star Wars where they say it's a period of civil war. She fed those sentences into it, and it gave you a line of poetry, the line of poetry that corresponded most beautifully to that line. So you have this really excellent star sonnet. What field of civil war, where lightning's made a terror of all space, an army when its king has fled, for all the memory with other after time, become earth with a dirge of cries. And so you come up with something really unique, special, and I've never seen anything like it in my life. So let's go to the next one. And this is Robin Sloane, who's a novelist who has 2 really super powerful GPUs in his house. And he runs the same technology that I did for my thing, but he can do it with his own GPUs, which is pretty amazing. And he took 1,000 different fantasy novels, fed them into that same engine, and then gave the names of 1,000 of his subscribers to that AI, and then generated a personalized, customized fantasy story for 1,000 of his readers. And here's just one example. And you can see it's a little nonsensical, but it sounds like a quest. It sounds like this fantasy story written about you. And he sent that to 1,000 of his email subscribers, and people shared it all over the place. It was really special. And then I work with Film Threat magazine, and this was AI-generated nonfiction. So using another engine, we fed hundreds of thousands of movie reviews into kind of the short sort of user summaries and things that people leave on movies, fed those to an AI, and then we came up with, it's actually, we invented kind of, we called him artificial intelligence reviewer. And so we started sharing movie reviews from Artificial Reviewer, and they were really special. And here, I'm just going to read just a little bit of it. This was about, I recommend this movie. It's Pain and Glory, Pedro Almodovar's new movie. And this is what he said. This is what our AI reviewer said. Pain and Glory, a movie by Spanish director Pedro Almodovar that's filled with beautiful moments and some of the most intense, beautiful scenes I've seen in a long time. The last act is nearly nonstop action and big explosions. It's epic, awesome, and bloody awesome. Feels like a cross between The Matrix, Matrix Reloaded, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So I've seen it, but I don't want to spoil it for you. But, and then finally, this is called AI Dungeon. And this is an interactive game that you can play, you can download on your phone for free. This college kid named Nick Walton built it using GPT-2. And it's basically, it's loaded with hundreds and hundreds of, it was trained on hundreds and hundreds of story games where you say, I would like to go west and see what happens. And it goes, you walk west, you find a treasure box. And you say, open treasure box. And you open the treasure box. And it says, inside the treasure box is a trap. You just died. It's that sort of storytelling thing. But this is AI generated, and it will literally never end. This is just an example of what it was, but this app will literally feed you story until your phone dies, and it's really magical. Or you die, yeah. And then finally, about that Rembrandt thing that we watched, the thing that makes me the most upset about it is it's all smoke and mirrors. Like, that was a highly produced video by a bank, and it's like they try to pretend like they're doing something really sophisticated, and they're not. Like, anyone in this room could learn over the next month or two how to do what those people are doing, and it's just out there, and I think it's important for you to learn about it. I think it's important for kids to learn about it. So I introduced my kids to GPT-2, and we took one of the stories that the story engine had made, and then we used the GAN, that same technology that we saw in the art thing, to generate computer images and to illustrate the story. And we picked them ourselves, and I showed them how the GAN works, and I showed them how GPT-2 works. And we actually made these little zines, these little physical things that we can share with people in the world. And I think that's really important because I want my kids to be comfortable with that. And I want everybody to just know that you can handle this stuff yourself, and it's coming. And there's a world where this stuff's going to be in everyone's hands, and I think that's important. So if you come up to me afterwards, I brought a few copies of these in lieu of cards, but thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm going to be a little more boring. I'm going to talk about copyright, actually, as you might guess. But before I do, I just want to say, artificial intelligence is bringing a lot of really cool new tools to writing and to the writing profession, and we're all already using some of them. Spell check. Google completes your emails now for you if you want them to. I'm looking forward to artificial intelligence where I can just dump all my ideas into it and then it organizes it. So I'm sure that's coming. But I do, because Jason spoke about GPT-2, I do want to mention another example of somebody using GPT-2. John Seabrook, I don't know how many of you read his article in the New Yorker, The Next Word. He did an experiment where he took 20 years or so of New Yorker articles and fed them into GPT-2 and then gave it a prompt to see if it could, the experiment was to see if it could write a New Yorker style article. And the prompt was an article about Ernest Hemingway. So I just want to read you what the AI writer did. As John said, the resulting language imitated the cadence and narrative rhythms of the New Yorker. He said when he read it, it's like, this is a New Yorker piece. This is amazing. But let me read you the first couple sentences. It describes the AI writer, describes walking up to Hemingway's gate in Cuba and seeing a dog who had been a common visitor before the war gallop up to a path to the main building with a tiny cow standing by her side. There is a puddle of red gravy in the front yard. So you can see, these are really good sentences, but there's a lot wrong here.
Is there a part about a cat?
Yeah, I'm sure if you go further, there's some cats, because Hemingway did have about 30 cats. He lived in Cuba. But I love, it's like a dog had been a common visitor before the war. The dog's galloping. The tiny cow's standing next to the dog that's galloping. It's hard to figure that out. The cow's tiny. Anyway. And then, of course, there's the puddle of red gravy in the front yard, which you can see how that might happen. But so anyway, I do, though, want to focus on a couple of what I see are really looming issues in copyright regarding AI. the digital age, as most of you who are in the copyright industries are very aware, has already been really hard on creators. Authors' incomes are down over 40%. The mean income of writers today is from the writing is only $20,000. I know it's been hard on songwriters, photographers, but it's nothing like what AI is going to bring. What I want to talk about today is the fact that that our current law does not adequately address a couple issues, and that if we don't proactively address them, we are going to see the creative industries further decimated. After all this fun, I hate to be so negative, but there you go. These are the two issues. One is the allowing the unlicensed use of copyright works to train AI under fair use, an issue that's been mentioned by a couple people already. And the second is the current volitional conduct in secondary liability cases where it's very possible that in the future we will have AI infringing and there's no one to sue, there's no one to hold liable. So first, let me talk about the ingestion issue. As we've already heard, for AI to generate, an AI machine to generate new works, and I'll focus on literary works, it has to train itself on large volumes of existing literary works, right? So that's how and we saw this with the new Rembrandt. So it's copying those works. Now, the output, though, is not infringing. Generally, the new Rembrandt, infringement is an analysis of does this work, is it substantially similar to this work? The outputs are really, they're, in a sense, this is a very broad, sweeping way of describing it, but they're mashups of a lot of different works that they've been fed, based on rules and parameters that they're given. But like the new Rembrandt, if Rembrandts were still in copyright, I don't think that you could say that the new Rembrandt necessarily infringed any true Rembrandt. So, we have to look at the initial copying, what some cases have called intermediate copying, and whether this is fair use. And I think there's some who argue, well, all of this should be fair use. This is intermediate copying. Look at the existing case law, which Sandra spoke a little bit about. I mean, this goes back to the Altai case. In copying works in order to basically reverse engineer them was fair use. Google Books, we see the court found that the end product was not infringing. It was just snippets. That was fair use in terms of what was human readable, but there were millions of copies made, many copies of millions of different works made in order to get to that end product. And in that case, and as well as the antitrust case, they treat this mass reading as though it weren't real reading. That somehow, because computers are doing it, it doesn't count. And companies, when they use computers to copy, they're given a pass. So an issue is that there's value in those works. Even if humans aren't reading them, there's value in them. Obviously, I don't agree that it should always be fair use, because what about when you're ingesting works to create competing works? And we can definitely see a future, it's not that far off, where maybe it's a more advanced version of GPT-2, ingest a lot of romance books, though in fact there are all the romance novels have already been ingested, and you can write new romance novels. Romance novels tend to follow a particular formula, and I'm actually not sure this isn't already happening. Kindle Unlimited basically a subscription service which has a lot of self-published books in it, and many of them are genre books, particularly a lot of romance books. You already find in there, there are all kinds of scammers. And the scammers are not authors, they're people who are just really good at scamming the system. So they take existing books, they put new covers on. Amazon has pretty much put an end to that. They change the words around a little bit, maybe new characters, and in the last year or two now we see these called cut and paste books where they actually will take different passages from like 20 different books and put them together and create a new book. And using click farms, they managed to get these books way up in the listings. And once you're high up in the listings on Amazon, then you're being promoted to readers, and you sell even more books. So I think that there's a real potential here for using AI by copying existing works to create new works. And something that we need to protect against. So I read a lot of the submissions to the PTO's notice of inquiry, and I think a lot of people in the industry said, well, you know, the fair use will sort out the okay uses from the uses, the competing uses, because if you actually copy works, ingest a lot of works in order to create competing works, that's not going to be fair use. And the argument is that, one, it's not transformative, which I agree with, and two, that under the fourth factor, the courts will find that it does negatively impact the market for the works. The problem is,
Mary, I don't want to interrupt too much. We have about 10 minutes left. So I want to make sure that Meredith has a chance to go.
Okay. So the problem there is that courts are not necessarily going to agree, because the damage, fair use cases are not set up to look at mass uses like this. The courts will say this particular work isn't necessarily, the market for it isn't going to be damaged. Really, the market that's damaged is the market for works like this in general. It's the overall ecosystem, and I don't think fair use is the right context to be making policy decisions about these things. So I'm going to jump ahead and say that what I would recommend is that there be some kind of licensing, collective licensing, and because, if we don't proactively address these issues, I think we are making a decision to give preference to AI over human writing, and we need to be conscious about that. A collective licensing system is how copyright has approached situations in the past where the transaction costs of licensing one-on-one are too high. I think an extended collective licensing would be most effective, and I'm sure that blockchain could be used somehow to make it automated, but I have no idea how. So better minds need to figure that out. Also, just real quick, that AI could infringe without being liable. Direct liability, the Cablevision case, you could find that there's nobody in the company that owns the AI that has volitional conduct. So we need to think about the volitional conduct and secondary liability. You could easily find no secondary liability also, particularly when we get to the point where AI is creating new AI machines. So we need to come up with rules about who's going to be liable in those cases. And again, I think licensing, collective licensing, some kind of automated collective licensing might be the answer there too.
Great. So luckily, Jason actually covered a good swath of the uses. I was going to talk about Janelle Shan, but I'm happy that she has a lot of love in this situation. She just recently wrote a book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You. And this was from when she tried to generate pickup lines through a neural net. And one of the results was, "You look like a thing, and I love you." So now that's the title of her book. Highly recommend going out and picking up. She's just wonderful. So a couple of things I want to talk about, and I'll keep it brief. One, as Jason mentioned, we have to sort of deal with the reality of the situation where it is right now. There are tools available, there are neural nets available for free or extremely low cost on the internet that you can play around with. You can go home today, you can probably pull some of them up on your phone right now and start feeding it data. These are wildly democratized tools. They are very popular, especially amongst the younger set. And you have situations where my nephew, for example, 16 years old, he plays around with neural nets in his spare time, because he actually saw Janelle's website and saw some of the stuff that she was doing, thought it was hilarious, and began to start generating his own neural nets. And so you have this sort of pocket of communities online who are exposed to these things largely through humor and start play with them sort of as is. As Mary pointed out, a lot of the times as you get farther down, the longer the output, the less and less likely it is to be considered passable for something generated by a human. The one I would like to read, actually, just because it is probably one of my favorite things, is Janelle Shan, again, tried to generate recipes through a neural net. Some of the results, one of them was just iced fridge water, was the name of the recipe, and then but it involved shrimp. I mean, it got pretty wild. So she had one that is called Chocolate Baked and Serves Cookies Desserts. And you can tell the exact moment where the AI got bored if you look through the ingredients list, which is 1 cup butter, 2 cups peanut butter, 1 cup sugar, 1 teaspoon vanilla extract, 3 eggs, 1 teaspoon baking powder, 1 cup white cocoa, 1 cup milk, 1 cup horseradish. She baked these, God bless her. She said someone actually ate a corner of one of them at the party she was at, so clearly there's a market there. And if you read through at the very end, the last step in the actual process is add chicken broth. So nobody's going to be mistaking most of these things for Julia Child anytime soon. But we sort of need to deal with the reality of the fact that these are out there, communities are using them organically, and these communities, I deal a lot with fan communities online, which tend to be interesting as they're sort of representative of self-organized examples of these communities, which are largely in touch with each other and sort of have shared practices. We've hit a situation both, to put this sort of, to get to the more important point, I'm trying to sort of pare down here. The most important point is that a lot of these communities online that engage in this kind of work and this kind of sort of unpaid labor really do this. They have a very different set of expectations about what is being done with the work than I think you're going to get from talking to folks who are primarily coming from an industrial perspective. These are folks who generate these things without expectation of paying or being paid. These are things that are circulated onto the internet for laughs in many cases. They are things that are circulated as kind of a here's an interesting concept work. And you have very different standards of what I sort of think of as folk copyright that happens online and in these self-organized communities. It tends to place very different values than what we necessarily have enshrined in the statutory copyright scheme. They tend to value attribution. They tend to value acknowledgement. They tend to value non-monetization in many cases. And some parts of this overlap with copyright law as written, and some of them do not. But we're sort of hitting a point where that delta between the sort of folk copyright that takes place on the internet, which is, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it's a net benefit or not, is very much the reality of how people think copyright works, is running up against issues of how it actually works and how we have constructed it to deal with very specific priorities about monetization and moral rights, which sometimes map and sometimes don't. But there's a very different set of priorities that have been ensconced in statutory law and how folks think copyright operates in sort of a common sense way. And this is an interesting forum because text-based neural nets and AI generation are very low processor power compared to a lot of other things. It's much easier to do than it is with video, for example, or sort of complex video game software where you have a lot of different sort of action conditions. Feeding something Harry Potter chapters and generating a Harry Potter fan fiction through a neural net is a thing that has happened. And it's happened several years ago. It's relatively easy to do because it is much easier to do. And if anyone's curious, the title of that fan fiction is Harry Potter and the Portrait of a Thing That Looked Like a Pile of Ash. They actually printed it out they mocked up a cover with the title on it and printed it out. It's like a 6-page thing. For some reason, the AI thought chapter 13 was all that it needed to print, so it starts at chapter 13. And we laugh because these things are fundamentally very silly for now. I think there's certainly going to be a point where we might have a competition problem, where people are generating things online that are in fact competitors for professionally produced by humans products. But I think, before I urge caution in that as we start to make policy on this, we have to make it based on the reality of where people are, because we are already in many aspects of copyright policy broadly, facing real tensions between how people think copyright operates, and it's not for lack of trying to educate in many cases, it's just how people intuitively think what a common sense copyright system prioritizes and looks like, and the complexities of a very, very intricate set of laws that we have basically duct taped one onto another since the 18th century. And as we are moving into this age where we have potentially conflicts at scale, we need to be very careful about how we structure that, and whether we structure that grounded in people's understandings, or whether we structure it grounded onto this several centuries old system, which in many ways in no way reflects people's understandings.
Great, thank you. That was perfectly timed with the end of our session. So thank you, everyone.